For a very long time, the modern world has told one simple story about omega-3. If you want it, you go to the ocean. You go to fish. You go to capsules, soft gels, labels, dosage charts, and glossy promises printed on a bottle. That story became so normal that almost nobody stops to ask a more dangerous question. What if one of the most important omega-3 plants in the world was never hidden by nature at all? What if it was already growing in kitchens, farm plots, mountain villages and market gardens across East Asia, long before the supplement industry taught people where nutrition was supposed to come from? Because long before fish oil became a product category, there was another source with a very different kind of history. It did not arrive through laboratories or modern branding, and it was never framed as some exotic discovery from the edge of the world. It began more quietly, as a seed, a leaf, and a household crop woven into ordinary life. And once you follow that trail backward, the modern omega-3 story starts to look much narrower than it first appears. The plant is perilla. In some places, it is known for its seeds. In others, for its leaves. In Japan, one form became closely associated with shiso. In Korea, it settled into daily food culture so deeply that it did not need to announce itself as medicine to remain important. In China, it belonged to an older botanical tradition, in which the boundary between food and remedy was never as rigid as the modern industrial world would later make it. That is the first thing that matters in this story. Perilla did not begin as a superfood. It began as part of life, and that difference changes everything. Because when a plant enters history as a daily thing instead of a miracle thing, it often leaves less dramatic evidence behind. It does not arrive wrapped in a marketing campaign. It does not come with a patent. It does not announce itself with one single invention date. It just keeps appearing, century after century, in food, in oil, in treatment manuals, in household practice, in habits that people stop explaining because everyone around them already understands. That is why this story does not begin in a supplement store. It begins in an older archive. In the early 17th century, Korea produced one of the great medical compilations of East Asia, the Donggi Bogam, completed under the physician Hyo Jun in 1613. It was not a book about one plant, but a much larger medical system, a record of how a civilization organized health, treatment, substances, and the body itself. That matters because it reminds us of something the modern nutritional world tends to forget. By the time industrial health products appeared, many cultures had already spent centuries building their own working maps of useful plants. Perilla belongs to that older map, not as a novelty, but as a known thing. And once you see it there, the modern version of the story becomes harder to accept. Because the usual assumption is that plant knowledge moved in one direction, from obscurity toward scientific validation, from folk habit toward formal importance. But perilla does not fit that clean timeline. In many parts of East Asia, it was already culturally validated long before modern Western consumers were taught to care about omega-3 at all. That is why the real surprise here is not that perilla exists. The real surprise is how completely one part of the world was taught to look past it. For more than 2,000 years, forms of perilla frutescens were cultivated and used in China. Over time, the plant spread through culinary, agricultural, and medicinal practice across neighboring regions. Different parts of the plant were valued for different reasons. The leaves, the seeds, and the oil each had their place in daily use. In some places, the plant was associated with aroma, preservation, pairing with fish, and household use. In others, it was treated as part of a wider medicinal vocabulary that connected digestion, respiration, circulation, and seasonal discomfort. That broad history is important, but history alone is not enough. The question is why this ordinary-looking plant deserves attention now. And the answer sits inside the seed. Because the seed is where the modern nutrition story suddenly collides with the old agricultural one. Perilla seed oil is unusually rich in alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, the plant-based omega-3 fatty acid that almost never gets the same cultural prestige as marine omega-3s. Even though it became part of the nutritional conversation long before most consumers understood the distinction, that alone would make perilla interesting. But perilla is not just a plant with some omega-3. It is one of the strongest plant examples in the category. And that is the point where the story starts to shift. Because once a plant moves from being culturally familiar to chemically measurable, it becomes harder to dismiss as folklore. Suddenly the old kitchen crop is no longer just traditional. Now it enters the modern language of lipids, composition, extraction, bioavailability, and comparative value. And that should have been the moment when perilla crossed over. It should have been the point when a plant already rooted in centuries of use moved naturally into the modern nutritional mainstream. But that is not what happened. Instead, the modern omega-3 narrative hardened around another image entirely. The sea, fish, cold water mythology, the romance of remote populations, and the authority of later packaging. That version was cleaner and far more marketable. It was easier to dose, easier to process, and easier to sell back to people in standardized units. Perilla, by contrast, belonged to an older logic. It was still connected to fields, gardens, food traditions, regional taste, seed pressing, and household familiarity. It could be eaten, grown, harvested, incorporated, remembered. It lived too close to ordinary life. And very often, that is exactly what modern systems do not know how to value. Modern systems are very good at valuing what can be extracted, standardized, sealed, branded, and repeated at scale. But a plant that can remain a food, an herb, an oil crop, and a piece of inherited knowledge at the same time, that kind of thing is harder to fit into a single commercial story. So perilla did not vanish because it was weak. It drifted out of view because the world that came later preferred a narrower kind of proof and a narrower kind of product. And in the next part of this story, that is where the real tension begins. Because once we leave the archive and move into the chemistry, the culinary record, and the modern omega-3 industry, it becomes clear that perilla was not merely forgotten. It was mismatched to the system that replaced it. If perilla had remained only a historical curiosity, the story would end there. A plant used for centuries. A regional ingredient. Another example of traditional knowledge that never crossed into the modern world. But that is not what the evidence shows. Because once researchers began analyzing perilla more closely, the numbers did not behave like folklore. They behaved like something measurable. Perilla seeds contain oil, which is not unusual. Many seeds do. What matters is the composition of that oil. When broken down, perilla seed oil repeatedly shows a very high proportion of alpha-linolenic acid, the plant-based omega-3 fatty acid that sits at the beginning of a much larger metabolic chain. This is where the story sharpens. Because ALA is not just another nutrient. It is one of the few essential fatty acids the human body cannot produce on its own. It has to come from somewhere. And for most people in the modern world, that somewhere has been simplified into a single answer: fish. But chemically, the situation is more complicated than that. Fish do not create omega-3 in isolation. They accumulate it through food chains, often beginning with algae and smaller organisms, which makes the ocean less an origin point than a delivery system, a concentration pathway. Perilla, by contrast, is a direct plant source, not a substitute in the sense of imitation, a different entry point into the same nutritional conversation. And that difference matters, because it changes how we think about origin. Instead of extracting omega-3 from marine ecosystems, perilla begins with a seed that can be grown, harvested, and processed on land. That does not automatically make it superior, but it makes it structurally different. And once you understand that difference, the next question becomes unavoidable. If a plant like this exists, and if it has been used for centuries, why did it never become the center of the omega-3 story? To answer that, you have to leave chemistry for a moment and return to daily life. In Japan, perilla, especially in its shiso form, entered food not as a supplement, but as a companion. It appeared alongside raw fish, not as decoration, but as part of the eating logic itself. It added aroma, balance, and in many cases, preservation value. In Korea, the leaves became something else entirely. A staple, layered into meals, wrapped around other foods, integrated into routine rather than singled out as special. Then there were the seeds, pressed into oil and used not only for food, but historically for practical purposes like lamp fuel and surface treatment. That detail seems small, but it reveals something important. The plant was not rare, not fragile, not experimental. It was reliable enough to serve multiple roles. A plant that can be food, oil, and utility at the same time tends to belong to stable systems, not fragile ones. And stable systems often become invisible over time, because people stop talking about what works. They only talk about what is new. That is exactly where perilla begins to fade from view, not in the regions where it was used, but in the regions where a different nutritional narrative was forming. The turning point arrives in the 20th century, and this time it does not come from a field or a kitchen, but from research. In the 1970s, studies of Greenland populations began to draw attention to the relationship between diet and cardiovascular health. And from there, the marine omega-3 story started to harden into something larger than observation. The idea that marine-based omega-3 fatty acids could play a protective role began to take hold. Over time, that idea moved from observation into recommendation, and from recommendation into product. Fish oil became something that could be extracted, standardized, encapsulated, and distributed. That transition is the key. Because once a nutrient becomes a product, the story around it changes. It is no longer just about where the nutrient exists. It is about how it can be delivered. Fish oil fit that transformation almost perfectly. It could be concentrated. It could be measured. It could be packaged into identical units. It could be sold as a repeat purchase, independent of cooking, culture, or geography. Perilla did not fit that model as easily. Not because it lacked value, but because it belonged to a different category. It was still tied to land, to seeds, to harvest cycles, to regional taste, to practices that could not be reduced to a single capsule. Even its strongest nutritional component, ALA, did not translate cleanly into the same messaging as marine omega-3s, which were framed around EPA and DHA and linked directly to specific health claims. So the story narrowed. This narrowing did not happen in a single moment or by a single decision. It happened gradually, through accumulation. One study, one product, one marketing line, one simplified explanation of where omega-3 was supposed to come from. And over time, the alternative pathways became quieter. Perilla did not disappear, but it stopped being part of the conversation. And when something leaves the conversation long enough, it begins to feel like it was never there at all. That is why, decades later, when modern studies revisit perilla, the results feel surprising, even though they are not new. Human trials begin to look at specific compounds within the plant, like rosmarinic acid, and their effect on seasonal discomfort. Other studies examine how perilla seed oil behaves in the body, how its fatty acids appear in blood plasma after consumption, how it integrates into metabolic pathways that are already well understood. None of this is mystical. None of this is sudden. It is the slow process of translating an old plant into a modern language. And in that translation, something becomes clear. Perilla was never outside the omega-3 story. It was simply outside the version of the story that became dominant. And that brings us to the present moment. Because now the conditions are changing again. The question is no longer just where nutrients come from. It is how dependent people want to be on systems that process, refine, and deliver them. And that is where the final layer of the story begins to matter. Not just as history or chemistry, but as possibility. By the time perilla reappears in modern research, the world it returns to is very different from the one it came from. Food is no longer just food. It is categorized, separated, processed, and often detached from the place it began. Nutrients are discussed in isolation. Ingredients are evaluated not by how they live inside a system, but by how easily they can be extracted from one. And in that environment, something like perilla creates a quiet kind of friction, because it does not belong to just one category. It can exist as a leaf, a seed, an oil, part of a meal, or something grown at very small scale. That flexibility is not a weakness, but it makes the plant harder to reduce to a single use. And that is exactly why it starts to matter again now. Because the modern question is beginning to shift. Not just, what should I take? But, what could I grow, use, or understand directly? That is where perilla re-enters the picture in a new way. Not as a replacement for everything that came after it, but as an alternative path that never fully disappeared. If you look, it does not depend on a specific region to survive. Under the right conditions, it can be grown in small spaces, in controlled environments, even in simple setups that resemble nothing like traditional agriculture. That is where the modern bucket idea comes from. Not from the claim that one container can solve nutrition forever, but from a much simpler observation. A plant that produces useful compounds does not need to be industrialized to be relevant. It just needs to be accessible. Perilla, it can be grown for leaves or allowed to mature for seed production. It can be approached as a microgreen, as a herb, or as a seasonal crop, depending on how it is handled. And each of those choices changes what you get from it. This is where the earlier confusion in the story begins to resolve. Because not every form of the plant carries the same nutritional weight. The leaves are valued for their flavor, their compounds, and their role in food. Microgreens can concentrate certain vitamins and antioxidants depending on how they are grown. But the strongest omega-3 signal still points back to the seeds and to the oil derived from them. That distinction matters, because it separates what is practical from what is exaggerated. Growing small batches of greens indoors may give you access to certain beneficial compounds. It may reconnect you with the plant. It may shorten the distance between production and use. But it is not the same as producing oil-rich seeds at scale. And it does not need to be. Because the real point is not to turn a bucket into a factory. The real point is to understand that the system we are used to is not the only system that exists. For a long time, the dominant model has been this. Nutrients are extracted somewhere else. They are processed, refined, standardized. They are delivered back to you in a finished form. Perilla represents a different logic. It begins closer to the source. It begins closer to food, closer to cultivation, and closer to something a person can handle, observe, and adjust, without needing an entire industrial chain behind it. That does not mean it replaces everything, but it changes the relationship. And once that relationship changes, the story that seems so fixed at the beginning starts to open up again. Because the original assumption was simple. Omega-3 comes from fish. But that was never the full picture. It was one version of the picture that became dominant at a particular time, under particular conditions, because it fit the systems that were expanding. Perilla does not contradict that story. It expands it. It shows that the same nutritional conversation can begin in a field instead of an ocean, in a seed instead of a capsule, in a plant that was never lost, only overlooked by a system that learned to value different things. And when you look at it that way, the question is no longer about choosing one source over another. It becomes something else. What kind of system do you want to depend on? One that delivers everything to you, already processed and decided. Or one that still leaves space for knowledge that can be grown, handled, and understood directly. Perilla does not answer that question on its own, but it changes how the question feels. Because it reminds us that some of the most useful things in the world are not new discoveries waiting to be found. They are older systems, still quietly working, waiting to be seen again. And once you see them, it becomes much harder to believe that the modern version of the story was ever the only one.